I mentioned that, I graduated a long time ago, back in 1994. And at the time, we knew that this whole digital thing was coming. We knew that there were digital cameras coming. And like I said, it wasn't an easy transition going from film to digital. Probably some of my most profitable years were when I worked at Dave Sterrett's studio. We had this Imicon FlexTight Precision 2 scanner. It was like a $27,000 scanner. In the evenings, I would get film from people and scan it and charge $50 a scan. And it wasn't unusual to get like 20 images from someone and make like $1,000 in an evening. So I quite enjoyed the transition. Photographers not so much, but it was a slow transition. And in fact, if you go back even further, I want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are with the digital cameras that we have. So let's just take a quick look at some of the historical events in the past. In 1981, like long before I'd even thought about college, Sony had come out with kind of an early version of a digital camera. They never actually marketed it, they never sold it. A lot of these cameras actually that we're going to show you right now weren't sold. They were prototypes, and it's the companies just kind of wanting to say, we've got our foot in the door, we know how to do this. So Sony came out with the Mavica, which wasn't technically a video camera, because it used a video signal, and it basically took a still frame from that video and recorded it onto these little 2-inch floppy disks called Mavipaks. With the Mavipak viewer, you could look at the images on a television, and look at the resolution here, 0.28 megapixels. Is that good? No. The biggest print you could probably make from that with reasonable quality would be like postage stamp sized. But you know what, for a first try for 1981, it's not bad. A few years later, they came out with their Pro Mavica, still used those little floppies. Still technically not a digital camera because it was taking a video signal. In fact, Mavica stood for magnetic video camera because it just took that video signal and recorded it onto a disc. Now, it had a 13 times zoom lens, a little bit higher resolution. You're looking at about $4 grand for the camera, more if you wanted the viewers and stuff. So this one they're actually starting to market. But again, 0.38 megapixels. There's a specific resolution, 0.3 megapixels. Do you guys remember when cell phones first got the ability to take photographs? I mean, you remember when a cell phone was a cell phone? You could make phone calls on it, and that was pretty much it. And then they started putting these little cameras on them. They were like stupid low resolution. On my honeymoon, we went to Paris, and we were at the Louvre, and there were people holding up their cell phones and taking pictures of the Mona Lisa. And I'm like, that's going to look stupid, 0.3 megapixels. It was the same resolution as a television of the time. You guys remember when televisions were big glass boxes? Weighed about 5,000 pounds, got really hot, cats like to sleep on top of them. The resolution of those televisions was 640 pixels wide by 480 pixels high, or 0.3 megapixels. And you'll see that pop up a lot. Early cell phones were 0.3 megapixels. It was what was called VGA resolution, or video graphics array. It was standard monitor size in the late 80s, early 90s. Same year, Canon came out with their RC-701. 0.187 megapixels. So again, you're thinking like, well, if you can't make anything bigger than like, postage stamp size, but if you're a security company and you need like, identification badges or just, just low-res images for, identification, it would do. And, we're not trying to get into, professional stuff here. This is just the company's kind of saying, this is coming, we're showing that we can do it. You were looking at about $3,800 for the camera. Came with an 11 to 66 millimeter lens, f1.2. Is that a small aperture, a big aperture? What is 1.2? Pretty wide. It's huge, isn't it? Why do you think it needed such a large aperture? To get light into it? Yeah, to let enough light in to actually make an image. Sensors weren't very sensitive back then. Like you guys are, I don't know if you know this, but you're a little bit spoiled. Like this, 104,000 ISO. When I was in college with film, 800 was considered fast film. You could get 1600, but you were looking at the kind of grain, like it's getting pretty nasty. Kodak had 3200 ISO black and white film called P3200, which I really liked shooting because I loved the grain of it. And we realized that if you were to push the film, push processing was a technique where you would underexpose the film and then overdevelop it. You could get like 12,000 ISO. We're like, that is crazy, 12,000 ISO. I mean, your photograph would look like someone took a bunch of Sharpies and went dot, 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 dot. It was just, you wouldn't be able to make an image out of it. But that was high ISO for the time. So these things, took a lot of light, so they put a big lens onto it. And if you actually wanted to do anything with it, it was like 3,800 for the camera, and about 34 grand if you wanted it with the player, recorder, a printer, a laminator, and look at this, a phone transmission system. Now this is something that was appealing to a lot of people. If you're, say, a photojournalist or a war photographer and you're out on the field, what they used to have to do was they would bring with them an entire darkroom, not just all their camera gear, but everything to process the film, everything to expose the paper, everything to develop the paper. So they would have to set up a darkroom in their hotel room. They put the enlarger over the toilet, the chemicals over the sink and stuff in the tub, and just process everything out when they got back from the shoot. And then they would have to put all their information on the back, all their contact information, so they knew who to credit it, get it into an envelope, and somehow get it back to their home office. The idea of being able to send it over a phone line was very appealing to them. Now, modems at the time, you guys remember modems? Those little things made that screechy sound when you connected to the internet? I was 14.4. Actually, the first one I ever saw, though, remember I mentioned I had a VIC-20. When we were buying that, in the store, we saw a modem. This was like in the late 1980s. It was basically a box with these two rubber suction cup kind of things. And at the time, phones were, just two little round things. You talk into one and listen into the other. And you would take those round things and shove them into the suction cups, and it would make little screechy noises to the computer on the other end, and that was how you sent the information. You'd stay real quiet so you wouldn't mess up the transfer. So it wasn't, there was no internet to speak of that existed, but normal people didn't have access to it. But you could get a direct phone connection and you could send stuff over the phone. That was incredibly appealing to people. Same year, Nikon came out with their SVC, 0.3 megapixels, that 640 by 480 resolution. Again, a prototype, they never marketed it, but they're just showing that, look, we know how to make this stuff. Next year, Casio had their VS-101, 0.28 megapixels, still pretty low res. The first marketed camera to use a MOS sensor. What kind of sensors do most of your cameras have? Anybody know? It's related to the MOS. You guys are probably all CMOS, complementary metal oxide semiconductor. But if you went back a few years, all of your cameras would have been CCD, which is a different technology for capturing images. CCDs had better quality, but they were really expensive to make, and they used a lot of power. So they were sucking back batteries like crazy. So they were trying to get proper CMOS or MOS sensors that would get good images. And Canon had a D30 years and years ago. It was the first one that had a CMOS sensor, and it was a big deal at the time. But most of you guys are going to be CMOS now. Does the shape of that camera look familiar? How many people remember 1987? No, okay. But if you went to a birthday party in 1987 and the parents were filming it, odds are the camcorder that they used would look like that. That is basically a 1987 vintage camcorder, and Casio has modified the internals to turn it into a digital camera. You'll see a lot of examples where companies are doing that. They're taking stuff that they already have, modifying it a bit to turn it into their digital counterparts. Why go through all the hassle of making new tooling if you've already got the technology to make that? So this was a kind of a modified camcorder into a digital camera. Here's an interesting approach. Minolta came out with the SB70 and SB90S, and does this part in here look familiar? That's just a regular old 35mm camera. It was designed to fit onto a Minolta Maxim 7 or 9000 film cameras. So if you're a photographer who's already heavily invested in, you got your Minolta 9000, you got your lenses, you got all your flashes and all the stuff to connect to your cameras, and some other company comes along and says, yeah, but for a whole lot of extra money, you can buy one of our digital cameras. And you're like, I've already got cameras. So by designing this, I was going to say this little thing, but this big honking thing that goes around the outside, basically you take the film door off of your film camera, mount this thing onto the back of it, and you're shooting digital. Again, not high-res digital, but you're taking digital photographs. So if you're heavily invested in a Minolta system, you just buy that back, clip it on, and away you go. And you'll see this idea used in other places as well. Same year, Kodak comes out with their Kodak still video system. Do you guys remember Kodak? Are they as big as they used to be? No, they've kind of gone down a bit, haven't they? They do some point and shoots, they do little bits here and there, but they did a big push into digital. They got pretty big into like medical imaging, and they came out with this thing called photo CD. Anybody ever heard of photo CD? Okay, it was an interesting attempt. The idea was, photographers had this huge problem. How do we get our photographs into our computers? Scanners were expensive. There was no real easy way of getting stuff in. And then Kodak said, well, you know what? We have this new system where when you're getting your film processed, you check the photo CD box, and in addition to processing your film, giving you your prints, giving you your negatives, you will also get back a CD containing a digitized version of your photographs. And photographers are like, this is brilliant. We just put this into our CD-ROM drives, and we can open up these, I think it was like 4 megabyte versions of our photographs. And Kodak is going, look, consumers, with this, you can buy a photo CD player, and you can look at your photographs on your televisions. And consumers are going, that's really stupid. And Kodak's going, but you want this. And the photographers are going, this is brilliant, we need that. And Kodak's going, shut up, we're trying to sell it to these people. They actually ended up sending about 250,000 of those photo CD players to the shredders because they couldn't sell them. Eventually, they realized what the photographers were saying, and they came out with the Pro Photo CD, which you could open up an 18 megabyte version of your image, which at the time was really big, and it was huge for photographers. But by then, they'd lost a lot of money off of that, and some other missteps here and there. They tried to get into the professional photography market. They made a lot of really good point-and-shoot cameras, and in fact, the first digital camera I ever bought was a Kodak. It was the DC 4800. A good size, you know, not too large, 3 megapixels, which at the time was really good, and built like a tank. I took this thing to Cuba, and it was on like a little kayak thing, and I didn't realize it was in my pocket, and it was actually in the ocean water for quite a long time. And when I got back to the hotel, I took the battery out, took the card out, left it in the sun, dried it, and it kept working. I still have it today, and it still works. When you change the exposure dial, you hear a bit of a grinding sound because there's sand in it, but you know, good stuff. But they made a push into professional. They made the, it was a 16 megapixel digital back and a complementary SLR that was, it was called the 14N, even though it was only 13.85 megapixels. And I actually went to the launch of that. They had a big event at the Kodak plant at Weston Road and Eglinton in Toronto. Unfortunately, Canon also had their flagship SLR, which was only 11 megapixels, but in testing, it actually out-resolved the 14 megapixel, the 13.85 Kodak, and that never sold, and they kind of never really recovered from that until they are where they are today. But by now, you can see that all the major players have their claims in there. Nikon, Sony, Casio, Kodak, Canon, they've all got their versions of the digital camera systems out there. A little while later, NASA gave the Hubble Space Telescope 4 sensors in there, but only 0.64 megapixels each. You guys have seen pictures from the Hubble, right? Nice high-res pictures of galaxies and nebulae and stuff. How do you think they get such high-res pictures if the sensor is only 0.64 megapixels? You ever notice that sometimes the photographs aren't exactly rectangles? Sometimes they're kind of like jagged, looks like squares all stuck together. That's actually how the thing works. It takes a bunch of pictures and stitches them together into one higher resolution version. It was about $1.5 billion US. They never commercially marketed it. I don't think it was sold very well. At the time, I thought that would be a brilliant camera to have for like, you know, weddings or something. You could say, you know what, you won't even know I'm there. I'll be on that mountaintop. You won't even see me. But then I found out recently that it was actually about 43 feet long and 11,000 pounds. So not as portable as I would have thought it would be. Same year, Kodak comes out with the DCS 100. All right, 1.3 megapixels. That's not too bad. If you're like a photojournalist in some far-off location and you're sending back photos that are going to be printed in a newspaper, newspapers aren't crazy high-res. They're usually about a 55 lines per inch screen. 1.3 megapixels, you could get something kind of publishable with that. Now, it was about $37,000. And it came with this 55-pound external unit that contained the batteries, a 200 megabyte hard drive, and a little black and white display so you could actually see what you had just photographed. Well, that's the thing. At 55 pounds, you don't want to be running through a war zone with people shooting at you. But it's the beginning. You can see it starting to happen. Next year, Crosfield. You'll see some names that you probably won't recognize. It was a very tumultuous time, the 90s, the early 2000s. There were a lot of companies that came and went, not just in hardware like this, but in software as well. HSC software, Aldis. There was a whole bunch of companies that either got bought up by other companies, mostly Adobe, or just disappeared on their own. Crosfield had come out with the Celsis 130 and 160, 1.22 and 7.1 megapixels respectively, and they used 3 CCDs. In your cameras, obviously you have one sensor, it's in the back there. You may have heard with video cameras, they'll often say 3 CCD, and they brag about the fact that they have 3 CCDs, and what does that mean? Basically, it means that the light that comes into the lens goes through splitters and gets split into 3 streams. One goes through a red filter, falls onto a CCD over here. One goes through a green filter, falls onto a CCD over here. One goes through a blue filter and falls onto a CCD over here. Those 3 images get combined into one full color image. Now, that reduced the sensitivity a bit, so they were really only practical for studio work. But if you were a catalog house, and at the time there were a few catalog houses around, which was basically a massive building. It was a company that would take in just truckloads of products every day. So places like, you know, Eaton's, Sears, Simpsons, The Bay, They would bring in all the stuff, these people would photograph it, and they did their own in-house processing. So they would often shoot slide film, E6 film, do their own processing, do their own scanning, do their own retouching. It was a one-stop shop for people that needed huge numbers of images. And the idea of doing digital, instead of having to pay for all this film, the processing, 7.1 megapixels. If you're doing like the Sears catalog, you could pretty much get a full page out of something like that. And it could save a whole lot of time and hassle. Catalog houses eventually kind of fell by the wayside. 91, same year, Sony came out with their SEPS-1000, a digital studio camera, 2.75 megapixels, getting a little bit better. Does this part here look familiar? If anybody watched like City News or any of the the news shows, the videographers would often have these great big video cameras on their shoulders. This is basically a broadcast video camera. This little arch down here was what would rest on the videographer's shoulder. So Sony manufactured a lot of these, and they, well, same thing. We already make all this stuff. Let's modify the internals a little bit, and suddenly it's a digital camera. Like $37,000. Great big monitor on top so you can see what you were photographing. And you can't see it from this angle, but these two little lines down here, if you were to look at it from the front, is actually a ring around the entire camera with gears on the inside. The idea being, right now it's set up to shoot horizontal, shoot landscape. If you wanted to shoot a vertical image with it, well, look at the size of that thing with the big monitor. Imagine trying to tilt that whole thing sideways. Your tripod would just fall right over. So with that ring, you could just rotate the camera inside the ring. Everything stays still. And I've seen similar setups for photographers. If you're, say, you're shooting a wedding and you've got your on-camera flash up here, nice pleasing light, the shadows fall down behind the subjects, but then you want to shoot vertical. If you turn the whole thing sideways, now your flash is on the side and your shadows are coming out beside the people. So I've seen the rings where you can just rotate your camera inside with the flash still staying on top. So that was their solution for not having to tilt this entire thing down when you want to shoot vertical. Hasselblad. 40s, 50s, they were the camera for like wedding photographers. There's one on the moon still. If anybody can get there, it's yours for the taking. Again, a lot of people were heavily invested in Hasselblad bodies. With the Hasselblads, it was a removable film back. You would hold onto the body, you would look down into a ground glass on top, or this one here actually has a prism that slides over top of the ground glass so you can look at it eye level. Lenses were expensive. You could be pretty heavily invested into Hasselblad. So they came up with this digital back, 4.2 megapixels, and it was actually made by a company called Leaf. You probably haven't heard of them either. They were big into scanning systems. They made some really good scanners. And since Hasselblad had a lot of experience making cameras, but no experience with digital, and Leaf had a lot of experience with digital, but no experience with cameras, they got together and Hasselblad had them make this back for them. The idea behind the removable back system was, let's say you're a wedding photographer, you would have your assistant following you around, and when you took your last frame, oh, I'm out of film, instead of having to reload there, you could take the back off, hand it to your assistant, you could put a new one on, load with film, and keep shooting. If you wanted to change film types, like from daylight to tungsten, or you wanted to change ISOs. Or, more interestingly, let's say you're working with a client, you're doing like a catalog shoot or something, and you want to know, does it look good? Well, with film, you didn't really know what you got until you processed it out and took a look at either the negatives or the print or the slide or whatever. With the removable systems, you could buy a Polaroid back for this. So you take the film back off, clip on the Polaroid back, make an exposure, pull the Polaroid, and you stand around for a minute and a half while it processed. Or if you're outside and it was cold, you'd put it in your armpit because, that's how we did it back then. When it was done, you'd peel it open, and you'd show the client and say, is this what you want? And if they said yes, you would have them sign the back of the Polaroid as confirmation that they've approved what they saw. And with this, instead of a Polaroid, you could just clip on your digital back, and suddenly you're making digital exposures. So again, you've got the investment in cameras and lenses. This makes it easy to switch. Next year, Kodak comes out with their DCS 200, 1.54 megapixels, and the beginning of the truly portable digital SLR. You'll notice here's this big thing on the bottom here made by Kodak, the DCS 200, and this sensor would kind of come up the back behind, wait a minute, Nikon. This also happened a lot too. Just like Leaf made the back for Hasselblad, Nikon made a lot of really good high-end SLR cameras. Kodak had the technology with the sensors and all kinds of stuff like that, so they made the electronics down here, the storage, the processing, and this thing would come up the back, replace the film door on a standard Nikon film camera, and you're shooting digital. So this was a collaboration between Nikon and Kodak. The first digital SLR I ever bought was a Fuji FinePix S2 Pro, and it said Fuji on the front, but it took Nikon lenses. It was basically a Nikon camera that Fuji had created the electronics for. And here's Canon's version. Notice with Kodaks, they've gone down the bottom here, and it kind of hangs off the bottom. A lot better than that 55-pound external unit, but still a little bit awkward hanging down like that. So Canon went with extending it out the back, much more in line with the Hasselblads, the professional medium format cameras of the day. Photographers were used to, if you're a professional photographer, you hold the camera like this and you look through the back. This thing hanging down, a little bit awkward. So prototype, they never marketed it. 1.3 megapixels, the DKC 5000, the cat's eye. It was 1.3 megapixels, 3 CCDs, and basically this little black box here was the camera itself. This was just a regular broadcast video lens mounted onto the front there. And then this cable connected it to this digitizing box down below, which had attached to it a preview monitor so you could see what you had just photographed. It could store a massive 2 photographs before you had to then flush it out to the computer that it was connected to. When I was working with it, it was connected to a Macintosh Quadra 840 AV with 24 megabytes of RAM, which at the time was a huge amount of RAM. This is when computers were coming with like 2, sometimes 4, maybe 8 megabytes of RAM if they were really high-end machines. So the camera itself, 1.4 pounds. The digitizer, 16.7 pounds. And you're looking at about $22,000 for the system. And with an upgrade, if you increase the memory in the digitizer, it could take 10 photographs. Again, appreciate what you have. The ability to pop in like a 64 or 128 gigabyte card into your camera and just shoot all day without having to worry about it. When I was in school, 35 millimeter came in 24 or 36 exposure rolls. When it was done, you had to rewind it, not too fast, you make static, which would put a little flash of light across it. Then you have to pop the door open, take it out, put the next roll in, pull the end of the film across onto the gears, close it, wind it on until it said 1, and then you could keep shooting again. There were options for shooting more. There were rollback adapters. Basically, you'd take the film back off your camera, put on this rollback that held 33 feet of film, which is about 250 exposures. Still nothing compared to what you guys can get onto one of your cards. I used to roll my own film, actually. You could buy 100-foot rolls of black and white film, and it had an Alden 74 daylight loader. You could put it in regular room light. You could put the cartridge in, you could wind on film, and it would count off the clicks, and I found you could get about 43 exposures into a cartridge before it started to bind inside the cartridge. So appreciate what you have. That 10-shot photo upgrade option, people would actually do it so they could get more frames in there. 1994, the Apple Quicktake. I remember when this came out. It was a big deal. It was the first affordable consumer digital camera, something that a company could say, yeah, I think we can get one of those. Let's say you got a company and maybe you have one of the laser printers. Apple came out with one of the first laser printers, kind of started the desktop publishing revolution, and you've got your monthly newsletter that goes out. And every month you got a photo of the employee of the month. Before this, you would have to have your film camera there, and Larry wins Employee of the Month, so you'd take a picture of him, you take the film in, get it processed, you get your negatives and your print back, and then you'd have to scan that, get it into the computer, and then you could put it into your newsletter and print it out. With this, you just say, hey Larry, stand against the wall there. Click. Connect it to your computer with a serial cable, drop it into the layout, and print it out. So the first camera that was affordable was around $1,000, I think, which at the time was actually quite a lot of money, but something they could afford to buy. It didn't have an LCD on it, so you couldn't see what you had just photographed. It did have an LCD, but it just told you how many shots you had left before you had to connect it to your computer by the serial cable and download the images. They came out with a couple variations after that. There's the Quicktake 2 and maybe a third version. But shortly after that, Steve Jobs came back to Apple. I don't know if you know this, but Apple almost went out of business for a while there. So they bought his company, Steve Jobs' company, Next, to get him back, and he just cut everything that wasn't a computer. Apple used to make hard drives. They had Apple hard drives, Apple laser printers, inkjet printers, Apple scanners, Apple cameras. All that got cut. And I guess it probably saved the company. Agfa. You guys remember Agfa? Anyone heard of them? They were big into film, mostly photographic papers. It was a European company, German, I think. And they made a run into digital as well. A lot of the best scanners were Agfa, the Arcus 2. On the high end, on the consumer level, they had the SnapScan, the StudioCam. This was their version of a portable SLR. This is the Agfa ActionCam. And I actually got to play with one of these. A photographer and I had borrowed one from Vistec, and we set up an acrylic sheet with a light below it, so it lit from behind, and we put on some products and we played around with it, and it was pretty good dynamic range. You know, not crazy high resolution, but it was a pretty good camera. And you'll notice Minolta, again, Agfa had all the technology, the electronics. Minolta knew how to make cameras, so they combined together and came up with the ActionCam. Also from Agfa was their StudioCam. Same year, 16 megapixels. And you think, oh, 16 megapixels, that's pretty good. You could do like a double-page magazine spread from that. Well, you could, except that it's a scanning camera, meaning it couldn't be used for moving subjects. You know how a scanner works. You put the photograph down on the scanner bed, and it goes bzzz, and it scans it. Basically, there's one row of pixels, makes its way across, and then rewinds, and there's the photograph. Same kind of deal with this camera. There was a single line of pixels. All of your cameras have what's called an array. Basically, it's a rectangle with millions of pixels in it. This was one line, and it would go bzzz across the image. So if your subject was moving, you could get some really weird effects that were nothing close to what you're looking for. So this is really only meant for like, you know, still life, studio, product stuff, I guess maybe dead people, but nothing that was moving. Even landscapes, if it was windy out and the trees were blowing, they would come out looking really wacky. So not really usable for moving stuff, but high enough res for catalog product. Last one we'll take a look at, the Dicomed BigShot 4000. This was a 16.7 megapixel single shot digital back. That was about $70,000. But you can see this is basically the camera here. This is, I think, a Bronica camera on the front. But the nice thing about these digital backs, like Hasselblad had one for their camera, and other companies started making them. This was Dicomed's voyage into it. Carnival had one as well. Megavision had their S2 Pro. You probably haven't heard of any of these companies because they're not around anymore. But the idea was you could mount them onto whatever camera system you happen to have. If you were a Bronica, you would buy the back and an adapter. And the photographer that I was working with at the time, I remember when we got our first digital back, it was a Hasselblad H20, and then we ended up with a P20, which was a portable version, actually had an LCD on it. But I remember when we got it, he took it out of the box and he's holding it in his hand going, this or a BMW. It was crazy expensive. But a very nice camera. Actually, he still has it. It's a piece of crap now. But at the time, it was really cool. So that pretty much brings us to today. I mean, not really. It brings us to 21 years ago. But after that, it was, you know, they were pretty good cameras. They weren't really what I would call affordable and comparable quality until probably 2000. I remember clients were asking me, so what kind of digital camera should I get to replace my film camera? And I felt bad saying, well, right now, nothing. There's nothing out there that's, you know, within your price range. But I mean, nowadays, you can buy a camera for $1,500. Will get you a pretty darn good starter system. So that's pretty much how we got to functional digital cameras, bypassing the whole film, the whole chemicals, the whole processing. And the worst part of scanning out the images was cleaning up all the dust spots. We called it dust busting, and you could spend hours doing that.